It was 10:47 p.m. when my manager texted me to cover the midnight shift at Walmart. This particular location was off a desolate highway, a place that somehow felt haunted, even during the day. I hated working late, but rent was due and my options were slim. Besides, what was the worst that could happen? Walking into the store, I was hit with the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of industrial cleaner. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. The usual late-night crowd of truckers and wandering insomniacs was absent. The first hour was uneventful. I stocked shelves, cleaned aisles, and dealt with the occasional customer. But around 1:30 a.m., things started to feel off. It began with the intercom. A high-pitched whine echoed through the store, followed by static. I walked over to the customer service desk to check it out. But before I could touch the panel, a voice crackled through the speaker. "Leave." I froze. The voice was distorted, garbled, but unmistakably human. "Very funny," I muttered, assuming it was some prank by my coworkers. But when I called for Sam, the overnight supervisor, there was no response. Shrugging it off, I went back to restocking the frozen foods aisle. That's when I saw her. A woman standing at the far end of the aisle, her back to me. She was dressed in a tattered white dress, her long black hair matted and dripping with water. "Ma'am? The store's closing soon," I lied, trying to sound authoritative. She didn't move. As I took a cautious step toward her, she tilted her head slightly, as if she had heard me but didn't care. "Ma'am, do you?" She turned abruptly, and I stopped cold. Her face, or lack thereof, was a void. Just smooth, pale skin where her eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The air around me felt heavy, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I blinked, and she was gone. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Maybe it was a shadow, a trick of the lights. Yeah, that had to be it. But as I turned to leave the aisle, something cold brushed against my arm. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Just rows of frozen dinners and bags of peas staring back at me. The cold touch had been real, though, like icy fingers grazing my skin. "Get it together," I whispered to myself, rubbing my arm as if to erase the sensation. I hurried back to the main aisle, the lights flickering above me in rhythmic bursts. Walmart lights always flicker, I told myself. Cheap maintenance. But the air felt different, heavier. My breath condensed in front of me like it was freezing inside the store. I grabbed my walkie and called for Sam again. "Sam? Are you there?" Static. "Okay, seriously, if you're pranking me, cut it out." "I'm not in the mood." I barked into the radio, but the only reply was the faint hiss of dead air. As I headed toward the break room to see if Sam was hiding out, I noticed the security monitors glowing faintly from the electronics counter. The live feed showed the entire store, empty and still, except for aisle 6. Someone was there. I leaned in closer, squinting at the grainy screen. It was a man, his back to the camera. He was tall, wearing what looked like an old flannel jacket. His head was tilted to the side, almost unnaturally, like he was studying the shelves or maybe listening for something. I looked up from the screen, down the aisle, and no one. But when I glanced back at the monitor, he was still there. Only now he wasn't alone. The woman from earlier, faceless, soaking wet, was standing behind him. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, stumbling back from the monitor. The lights overhead buzzed loudly and flickered, plunging the electronics section into brief, stuttering darkness. When they came back on, I looked back at the screen. Empty. I backed away slowly, clutching my walkie. "Sam, pick up. Right now." Faint crackle. Then finally a voice, "Break room." I exhaled in relief. "Where the hell have you been? Something's going on in this store." But the walkie went silent again. As I pushed open the door to the break room, I immediately noticed the smell. Metallic, like blood. "Sam!" I called, stepping inside. The fluorescent light flickered erratically, casting everything in a sickly, greenish hue. The room was a mess. Chairs overturned, papers scattered across the floor. And then I saw him. Sam was slumped in the corner, his face pale and his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. His walkie was still clutched in his hand. I rushed over to him. "Sam, are you okay?" His lips moved, barely, like he was trying to speak. I leaned in closer. "They're here," he rasped. "Who's here?" I demanded, shaking him. His eyes darted toward the door, and then his body went limp. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway outside. I froze, holding my breath as the steps grew louder. Closer. Something scraped against the floor, a sound like nails dragging across tile. Then, a voice. Low, guttural, and impossibly close. "Leave." I didn't move. Couldn't move. The voice, deep and wet, like it was gurgling up from a drowned throat, seemed to echo inside my head. "Leave." The footsteps stopped just outside the break room door. I stared at the handle, willing it not to turn. My hand clutched Sam's walkie so tightly it dug into my palm. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the sound of breathing. Slow, raspy, and too low to be human. It was like standing next to a wild animal, its breath rolling out in waves of menace. My chest tightened. I had to get out. I slid toward the door as quietly as I could, keeping my back against the wall. My sneakers squeaked faintly against the tile, and the breathing on the other side of the door stopped. Suddenly, the door handle rattled violently. I jumped back, slamming into a metal locker. The handle twisted, but the door didn't open. It was like whoever or whatever was out there didn't understand how to use it. That bought me seconds, maybe less. I needed a plan. My eyes darted around the room, landing on the emergency fire exit on the opposite wall. I could make it if I moved fast enough. I pulled my phone from my pocket to use as a light, but when I unlocked the screen, it flickered and died. The battery had been at 60% a few minutes ago. A sudden bang against the door made me jump. And then another. Something was throwing itself against the break room door, each hit bending the thin metal inward. I bolted for the fire exit, pushing the bar with all my weight. The door groaned, then gave way, and I spilled into the cold night air. But the relief was short-lived. As I turned to run for the parking lot, I stopped. The lot was full of figures, standing in the dark, perfectly still, facing the store. There had to be at least 20 of them. Men, women, even children, all standing in a straight line. And at the center of the group was her, the faceless woman. She stepped forward, moving unnaturally, like her limbs didn't belong to her. Her head tilted slightly to one side, and though she had no eyes, I felt her staring at me. I stumbled backward, retreating toward the store, but when I glanced behind me, the fire exit had vanished. Just solid concrete. No, 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 I muttered, spinning in place. The figures began to move, closing in. Their steps were slow, deliberate, in perfect unison. The sound of their feet on the asphalt filled the air like a death march. My only option was to go back inside. I turned and ran toward the automatic doors at the front of the store. They slid open with a cheerful ding that felt horribly out of place. Once I was inside, the doors slammed shut behind me, locking with a heavy clunk. The store was dark now. The lights had gone out completely, leaving only the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. I ran down an aisle, desperate to find a place to hide. The shelves seemed taller than before, the aisles stretching endlessly in every direction like some kind of maze. I passed by mannequins in the clothing section, their lifeless eyes following me as I ran. In the distance, I heard the faint hum of the intercom. "Leave." The voice was louder this time, angrier. I ducked into the toy aisle, crouching behind a rack of stuffed animals. My breathing was shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then I heard it. Footsteps, coming down the aisle. They were slow, deliberate, and too heavy to belong to a normal person. I pressed myself against the shelf, clutching a stuffed bear like it could somehow protect me. And then, just beyond the shelf, I saw it. A hand. But it wasn't a hand anymore. The fingers were too long, the skin mottled and gray, the nails jagged and blackened. The hand flexed, its fingers tapping against the metal shelf as if testing it. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming. The hand lingered for a moment, then pulled away. The footsteps continued down the aisle, fading into the distance. But just as I exhaled in relief, the intercom crackled to life again. "I see you." The voice on the intercom sent a shock through my entire body. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the rows of stuffed animals in front of me, their plastic eyes glinting in the faint glow of the emergency exit lights. It knows where I am. I had to move. Slowly, I peeked around the edge of the shelf. The aisle was empty, but I could hear the faint sound of something wet dragging along the tile floor. It wasn't footsteps this time, whatever it was sounded like it was crawling. I crept out of the toy aisle, hugging the shelves as I moved toward the back of the store. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, and then I saw it. At the far end of the aisle, something emerged from the shadows. It was hunched over, its limbs unnaturally long, its movements jerky, like a marionette being forced to dance. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight, and its head lolled to one side as if its neck was broken. But the worst part? It was wearing a Walmart vest. The name tag on its chest read Chuck. "Chuck," I whispered, my voice trembling. Chuck had been the guy who trained me during my first week. He'd been a little weird, sure, but he didn't deserve this. The thing turned its head toward me with a sickening crack, its empty eyes locking onto mine, and then it smiled. I bolted. My sneakers squealed against the tile as I sprinted down the aisles, knocking over displays and shelves in my panic. The thing behind me let out a guttural screech and gave chase, its limbs skittering across the floor like a spider. I rounded a corner, only to collide with something solid. I stumbled back, looking up, and froze. It was the faceless woman. She stood motionless, her blank face tilted downward as if staring at me. Her wet hair dripped onto the floor, forming dark puddles at her feet. Behind me, Chuck Thing screeched again, closing the distance. I was trapped. "Please," I begged the faceless woman, my voice cracking. "Please don't." She raised a hand, pointing toward the left. Confused but desperate, I followed her direction, darting into the nearest aisle. I didn't look back to see if she or Chuck Thing was following me. I just ran. The aisle I entered was unfamiliar. It wasn't stocked with the usual Walmart items. Instead, the shelves were lined with objects I couldn't identify, warped, misshapen things that seemed to pulse faintly under the dim light. The walls were wrong too, curving inward like I was running through some kind of tunnel. The air was thick, oppressive, and smelled of damp earth and decay. And then, ahead of me, I saw it. A door. It stood at the end of the aisle, completely out of place in the warped environment around it. It was old, made of dark, rotting wood, with a brass handle that gleamed faintly. Behind me, I could hear Chuck Thing and others, yes, others now, skittering and dragging themselves closer. I didn't have a choice. I grabbed the handle and threw the door open, plunging into the darkness beyond. For a moment, I thought I'd fallen into a void. The air was cold, my body weightless. Then I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I scrambled to my feet, looking around. I was back in the store, or at least it looked like the store. The aisles were intact, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint music played in the background. But something was wrong. The store was completely empty. No customers, no staff, not even the faceless woman or Chuck Thing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing eerily. No answer. I made my way toward the front doors, my footsteps loud in the silence. But when I reached them, I stopped. The doors weren't there anymore. In their place was a wall of mirrors, stretching endlessly in either direction. I stared at my reflection, my heart sinking. Something was wrong with it. My reflection didn't move. I froze, staring at the reflection that wasn't mine. My chest was rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths, but the version of me in the mirror stood perfectly still. Its expression was blank, eyes unblinking, lips slightly parted, as if it was waiting for something. I took a step back. My reflection stayed put. What the hell?" I stammered, reaching out toward the glass. The moment my fingertips brushed its surface, the reflection moved, but not like me. Its hand slammed against the other side of the mirror, matching my fingers perfectly. The impact sent a shudder through the glass, rippling like water. And then it smiled. Not a friendly smile. Its teeth were too white, too sharp, stretching far too wide across its face. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and landing hard on the tile. The muzak in the store warped, slowing and distorting into a deep, grinding hum. The reflection tilted its head unnaturally, still staring at me through the glass. And then, without warning, it stepped forward. The glass didn't shatter. It simply parted like liquid as the reflection stepped out of the mirror. I scrambled to my feet, backing away as it approached. Its movements were jerky, wrong, like it didn't fully understand how to use a body. "Stay back," I shouted, grabbing a nearby display rack and shoving it between us. The reflection stopped, its head tilting again as it regarded me. Then, to my horror, it spoke. "You don't belong here." Its voice was hollow, layered, like multiple people were speaking at once. I just want to leave," I stammered, clutching the display rack like it was some kind of shield. The reflection let out a low, guttural laugh. "No one leaves. Not once they've seen." "Seen what?" It didn't answer. Instead, it raised its arm, pointing toward something behind me. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. The aisles were shifting, rearranging themselves like a twisted labyrinth. The shelves groaned and creaked as they moved, towering higher and higher until they scraped the ceiling. And in the shadows between the aisles, they were waiting. The faceless woman, Chuck Thing, and others, dozens of them. Figures I didn't recognize but that radiated the same wrongness. Their shapes were distorted, their limbs too long or bent at impossible angles. Some crawled on all fours, others hovered inches above the ground. They were all watching me. I turned back to the reflection, panic surging through me. "Why are you doing this? What do you want?" Its smile widened impossibly, splitting its face. "You don't understand," it said. "This isn't your store. It's ours." Before I could respond, the reflection lunged at me. I screamed, throwing the display rack at it, but it passed straight through like smoke. I ran. The aisles twisted and shifted around me, the shelves bending and stretching as if the store itself was alive. The figures in the shadows began to move, closing in from all directions. I turned a corner and skidded to a halt. The faceless woman stood in front of me, her head tilted downward. Her hand slowly rose, pointing toward an aisle to my left. I hesitated, but the sound of skittering limbs behind me forced my decision. I ran where she pointed, not knowing if it was a trap or my only chance. The aisle led to another door. This one was smaller, metal, with no handle, just a small window at eye level. Through it, I could see the parking lot, empty and bathed in moonlight. Freedom. I slammed into the door, pounding on it with both fists. "Let me out." The figures were closing in now, their distorted shapes spilling into the aisle like a tide of nightmares. "Please," I screamed, throwing my shoulder against the door. It didn't budge. But then, just as the nearest figure reached out for me, the door swung open. I stumbled through, collapsing onto the asphalt outside. When I looked up, the door was gone. The store behind me was dark and silent, its windows reflecting nothing but emptiness. I staggered to my feet, breathing heavily as I scanned the parking lot. My car was still there, and for the first time in hours, I felt a sliver of hope. I got in, fumbling with the keys as I started the engine. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The Walmart stood quietly in the distance, looking perfectly normal. But just before it disappeared from view, I saw them. Figures standing in the lot watching me leave. And in the middle of them was my reflection, smiling. I didn't stop driving until I saw the lights of the city in the distance. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel, and every shadow on the side of the highway looked like it was reaching for me. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my apartment building, the clock on my dashboard read 4:12 a.m. I had no memory of the drive, just fragments of headlights and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I killed the engine and sat there in the silence, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. It looked normal now, just me, But the memory of that twisted smile burned in my mind, and I couldn't look at myself for long. Grabbing my bag, I made my way up to my apartment. The hallway was quiet, the faint hum of the vending machine by the elevator the only sound. When I got inside, I locked the door, bolted it, and pushed my couch against it for good measure. I knew how ridiculous it looked, but I didn't care. I turned on every light in the apartment, checked every closet, every corner. No shadows shifted, no footsteps followed me. It was just me alone. Finally, I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling as the adrenaline wore off. "It's over," I whispered to myself. "It's over." But deep down, I didn't believe it. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the clock on my phone read 5:44 a.m. The first rays of dawn were creeping through the blinds, painting the room in pale light. For a moment, I felt a fragile sense of peace. Maybe it really had been some sort of hallucination, a stress-induced nightmare. Then I noticed my phone's battery. It was at 6%. I had charged it before my shift, and I hadn't touched it since. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I slowly scanned the room, every nerve in my body screaming that I wasn't alone. And then I heard it, a faint tap, tap, tap coming from the kitchen. I froze. My kitchen was tiny. No one could hide there without me seeing them. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. Slowly, I stood and crept toward the kitchen, every step feeling like I was walking into my own grave. The window faced the alley behind the building, where the dumpsters were. It was too high off the ground for anyone to reach, or so I thought. When I peeked through the blinds, my heart nearly stopped. The faceless woman was standing outside, her head tilted up toward the window. She pressed her hand against the glass, her wet hair clinging to her body. Behind her, in the shadows of the alley, I could see others, figures, watching, waiting. The woman raised her other hand, pointing toward the door of my apartment. My stomach dropped. "No," I whispered, backing away from the window. "You can't be here. You can't be here." A soft knock came from the front door. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The knock came again, louder this time. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The knocking stopped. For a moment, I dared to hope they'd left. Then the voice came, low and guttural, from just the other side of the door. "You never left." The lights in my apartment flickered and went out. In the suffocating darkness, I scrambled to find my phone. The faint glow of the screen lit up the room just enough to see that the shadows in the corners were moving. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911. Before the call could connect, the screen glitched, static rippling across the display. And then the voice came through the speaker. "You can't escape us." The phone went dead in my hand. I ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind me. The tiny room was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the digital clock on my toothbrush charger. I pressed myself against the wall, clutching the phone like a lifeline. Outside the door, I could hear them, whispers, scraping, wet footsteps moving through my apartment. Something pressed against the other side of the bathroom door. The wood creaked, the handle rattling violently. And then the voice. "Look." The small mirror above the sink lit up faintly, like it was glowing from within. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But something made me turn my head. My reflection stared back at me, smiling that impossible, twisted smile. And then it spoke. "We told you. This is our world now." I stared at the mirror, my breath catching in my throat as my reflection leaned closer, grinning like it had one. Its movements were deliberate, but they weren't mine. It tilted its head, just like the faceless woman had, and raised a hand to the glass, pressing its fingers against the surface. Then it spoke again, its voice a guttural symphony of layered tones. "Let us in." The bathroom door rattled violently behind me, the wood groaning as something slammed against it. Shadows seeped in under the door, curling like smoke, creeping toward me. My reflection in the mirror began to ripple, like it was underwater, its grin stretching wider, splitting its face. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. The reflection chuckled. A sound so hollow it made my skin crawl. You saw us. Now you belong to us. The shadows reached my feet, cold and wet, like tendrils dragging me down into the abyss. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor as I pressed my back against the wall, heart racing. Fight! I whispered to myself. Fight it! I reached blindly for something, anything, to defend myself. My fingers found the cold, ceramic base of the toothbrush holder. It wasn't much, but it was something. The mirror's surface began to bulge outward, my reflection clawing its way through the glass. Its fingers, twisted and too long, broke free first, followed by its face, now stretched into something barely human. Before I could think, I screamed and swung the toothbrush holder with all my strength. The mirror shattered, shards of glass exploding outward, slicing into my skin. The reflection let out an inhuman shriek, its form dissolving into black smoke that filled the room. The bathroom door flew open, and the faceless woman stood there, the shadows swirling around her like a storm. Behind her, the others, Chuck Thing, the twisted shapes, watched silently, their empty eyes glowing faintly. I stumbled to my feet, blood dripping from my hands, the shattered mirror at my feet. Leave me alone, I screamed, backing into the corner. The faceless woman tilted her head, her wet hair dripping onto the floor. Slowly, she raised a hand and pointed to the shards of glass. I looked down. The largest shard still reflected my face, but it wasn't mine. It was theirs. The reflection smirked. You'll never leave. No, I said, shaking my head. You don't own me. In one last, desperate act, I grabbed the shard and drove it into my arm, slicing through my own flesh. The pain was excruciating, but the shadows recoiled, hissing like steam. The faceless woman let out a mournful wail, and the others began to fade, their forms dissolving into mist. The last thing I saw before the world went dark was the mirror shard, its surface slick with my blood, as the twisted reflection faded into nothing. I woke up in a hospital bed. The room was bright, sterile, the hum of machines filling the silence. My arm was bandaged heavily, and a nurse was adjusting the four next to me. You're lucky someone found you, she said, smiling faintly. You were bleeding out when they brought you in. I blinked, my mind sluggish. Who found me? The nurse's smile faltered. We don't know. The paramedics said a woman called it in but disappeared before they arrived. A woman. My heart raced as memories flooded back. The shadows, the figures, the faceless woman, my reflection. It's over, I whispered to myself, tears streaming down my face. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I sat in my hospital bed, staring at the small bathroom mirror across the room. My reflection stared back perfectly normal, until it blinked, and I didn't. The lights flickered, and a voice, low, guttural, and unmistakable, whispered from the shadows. You never left.